You're listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Alright, how's it going? Time for another Straight to Video podcast, and I had a real good time on this one. On today's show, I bring you a chat with media historian and associate professor at Northumbria University, Johnny Walker, author of the excellent new book Rewind, Replay, Britain and the Video Boom 1978 to 1992. Obviously, this show is called Straight to Video, and many of you know my love and passion for all things video and VHS, as it's really a direct time travel to my younger years, which I think when you hit a certain age, you begin to hopefully look back on so fondly. So for me to chat with Johnny all about this and the history and impact of what is now really kind of a dead format, but still has such a place in many people's hearts, was a lot of fun. But I'm not gonna lie, I was a little intimidated going into this chat. Once you dive into the details and knowledge that Johnny presents in this new book, I thought, am I going to sound like an idiot? Do I really have any clue whatsoever about videos and their actual history, other than maybe what trailers were on the beginning of summer school or which films had reversible covers? Because to be fair, that's pretty much all I got. But I shouldn't have worried. Johnny, much like everyone else in the VHS community, either online or who I meet in the 80s video shop we've recently opened, are just top people who share that same enthusiasm, have similar memories, and just want to talk about it all. So as you'll hear in this chat, we had a great time. Now, Johnny's book, Rewind, Replay, is available from EdinburghUniversityPress.com, or you can meet him in person when he heads to Derby at the Quad Cinema on Saturday, September the 24th, as part of their Paris Cinema Festival, where he'll be taking part in a live Q&A. Tickets for that event can be found at pariscinema.co.uk, but right now, let's dive into my really fun straight-to-video chat with Johnny Walker.
Thanks, mate, for having us, by the way. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure. I can't remember how I kind of heard about you. I think it was through Charlie in the VHS Video Club group.
Quite possibly. To be honest, I just know him through that group in the fact that, like, he's one of the there's a group of the members of that group who are really interested in the history of video beyond the video nasties or beyond horror, cult and exploitation cinema. And I mean, that's my bread and butter as well. I love all that stuff. You know, I really appreciate being able to speak to people like Charlie and now yourself about stuff that lies beyond that, the general history of that period and its significance.
Awesome, man. Yeah, so I'm stoked we got to hook this up. First up, congratulations on the new book, Rewind, Replay, which is such a great insight focusing on the rise and explosion of videotapes, video rental here, particularly in the UK, from 1978 through to 92. I want to chat about the book and how it came together and things you discovered and learned, but also if it's cool to hear a little about you yourself and some of your own personal experiences with VHS and films in general.
Absolutely, mate. I should say, just so we're clear, a pleasure to be on the show. It's a great podcast. So, you know, the fact that little old me has been included among your illustrious lineup is an honour. Did I see Stephen Pearcy from Rat? You've had him on.
You did, yes.
Yeah, well, you know, that's good enough for me.
Nice one. I think I saw some Dokken and Kiss images on your Facebook page.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, like, I like to think I'm a punk at heart, right? And, like, my favourite band is Stiff Little Fingers. But, you know, the flip side of that is, like, my alter ego is that I'm a massive hair metal fan. And 80s era Kiss, the no makeup phase, is my favourite Kiss era. I mean, you know, horror films of the 1980s inevitably were accompanied by some anonymous hair metal band or another. So I think the 80s and hair metal, you can't really separate the two.
Did, like, horror introduce you to any bands?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, it's a cliche, but Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and, you know, by Dokken, that was a gateway for me into loads of bands that I probably would otherwise not have even given the time of day. And I'm talking like bands like Cinderella, but also bands at the sort of the top end, as it were, of that period, like Whitesnake, which, you know, I appreciate have a long history, but probably never would have listened to Whitesnake had it not been for me watching Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and then hearing Dokken and then sort of like working backwards.
That was such a landmark one. I think particularly in America. I don't think they did it in the UK, but when Dream Warriors came out on video in America, it was like advertised, like at the end of this film, you can watch the video for Dream Warriors.
Absolutely. And if I understand it, and I could be wrong about this, but I think that song and that video was the first ever attempt at sort of bridging that gap between like what you see on screen and, you know, integrating footage into the actual music video itself from the film. Like, I'm pretty sure that was one of the first, at least.
You might have had promo videos where it showed clips from films, but that one was where Freddie was actually interacting with Don Dokken and George Lynch and all that kind of thing. So it was like extra footage film to actually really mash the two worlds together.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, if you watch that, video now, it doesn't necessarily hold up. But I think what is the 80s, if not excess and people doing ridiculous things as if it's perfectly normal?
You're a professor up at Northumbria University.
Well, I'm an associate professor.
An associate professor.
Maybe one day I'll be full professor. So you know you've made it when you're professor.
Right.
So I'm associate professor, which is essentially like a rung below that.
Right, okay.
Maybe when I'm aged, old and grey, I might get to be a prof.
Are you born and raised around that area? Is that where you're from?
Yeah. So I was born in 87 in Hexham, and then I grew up in like a mining village, Crowcrook it's called. I don't imagine you've heard of it. I live in Whitley Bay now on the coast, but I did a lot of stuff. So I mean, born and bred in the northeast, but I spent about 4 or 5 years in the Midlands.
Yeah, because you come down to De Montfort University in Leicester as a lecturer.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I did my PhD at De Montfort actually. And then I worked there for maybe a year or something before landing a gig at Northumbria. And I've been here for like 9 years or something, which is mental. And a lot has happened in that 9 years.
Oh, mate.
Like politically in the world, but also like personally just with kids and stuff.
So born in 87, that's a great year.
Yeah, indeed it is.
Great year for film, in my opinion. One of the best.
Yeah, great year for hair metal as well.
Oh, yeah. I think I actually realised this year a couple of my all-time favourite films, Monster Squad and Can't Buy Me Love, were released on the same day in 1987. I'm like, damn.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe I was born on that day as well. And that could be like the holy trinity of things that happened in 87. I don't think I'll be that lucky.
Another favourite film, North Shore as well. I don't know if you're familiar with North Shore, the surfing film.
No, I'm not actually.
35 years old this year as well, 1987. I always associate it as Karate Kid, but with surfing.
I'm surprised that it's eluded me for so long, to be honest, if that's your pitch as to what it is.
That's my pitch. That's all you need. A guy moves from another town. He's kind of good at surfing, but not as good as everyone around him. You need to check it out.
That's the first thing I'm going to do after this, mate. Can we wrap this up quickly, actually, so I can...
Go check out North Shore. Did you always see yourself wanting to work or teach in an area film-related? Was that always something you had in mind?
Well, it's funny because, I've been a fan of this stuff. So, like I say, I was born in the late 80s, so, all the content of my book essentially eluded me because I wasn't old enough. I didn't experience the video nasties or none of that stuff. But I was always a fan of the video shop. You know, like so many people of my generation, of your generation, we have memories of going into video shops, being confronted with a wall of different films, and inevitably, you probably, like so many people who move in our circles, I was really drawn in to the artwork of horror films in particular, specifically Graham Humphrey's box art for A Nightmare on Elm Street 2.
Yes.
Freddy's Revenge, which of course has Freddy above the school bus, and I thought that was a really evocative image, but also not like a million miles away from a superhero comic book front cover.
That's a great comparison. I've never really thought of it in that way, but yeah, definitely.
And I just think, like, if you look at an image like that, and in fact, if you look at a lot of that style of artwork from that period, the late 80s into the 1990s, as artists were really veering closer towards photorealism, you know, trying to sort of capture the realism of something. That's not a million miles away from what comic book artists were doing. And even though probably wouldn't say Graham Humphrey's style is super photorealistic, I think there's certainly an expression, there's an element to it which is sort of different to, say, Drew Struzan's Back to the Future artwork or whatever. Nevertheless, that style really does represent an era for me and does trigger nostalgia. And if you're a kid in the video shop and you see all these bright colours, I think it's natural that you would gravitate towards that stuff, especially if you were interested in Superman Superman or Spider-Man or whatever.
What year would that be then when you're recalling seeing like Freddy's Revenge on the video shelves?
I reckon probably the early 90s, I would say, maybe 94, maybe a little bit earlier than that. Because, I mean, I remember this vividly. Like seeing the image of Freddy and saying to my dad, who was that? Like, what's that? And interestingly, he didn't say, that's Freddy Krueger. He said, that's Robert Englund.
Wow, right.
And I was like, Robert Englund? What does that even mean? And of course, gradually I got to learn more about who Freddy was. You know, speak to the staff in the video shop. I had a babysitter who had seen the Nightmare on Elm Street films. And I was just like beyond curious.
Was your dad a big film fan then?
Not especially, but he did have very evocative memories of like going to the cinema and seeing Halloween, for instance, and watching Psycho and The Exorcist, like basically the big hitters of the 60s and the 70s. And he tells a great story of watching Salem's Lot, the TV movie, the Tobe Hooper film, which he showed me when I was far too young. And that really scared me, that film. But, you know, he tells a story of like, he was watching that 76 or whenever it was broadcast, you know, chasing my mother around the house with like tomato sauce, like coming out of his mouth and stuff. So like, there's a lot of touchstone moments for me when I remember like talking to my parents, talking to my dad about the experience of cinema, but specifically the experience of horror cinema. I suppose we would call it like its affective properties or whatever. Like, what is it about horror that moves people? And for me, it was the colours of Graham Humphrey's artwork initially. And for my dad, obviously, it was experiencing those films and then telling me about those experiences.
You were sold already.
I was sold already, for sure.
I've had so many things like that where people have told me about something. I think my uncle told me about Fright Night.
Right.
After he'd seen it and he like, gave me the premise of the story and then combined that with the artwork as well. I already loved that film before I'd even seen it.
Yeah, and it was the same with me. And I remember seeing A Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time, like covertly at my like a family friend's house. I mean, I was quite impressionable as a kid, and like I say, I'd seen some of the sequences from Salem's Lot, scratching in the window and like the scene where it's like, look at me, and really sort of haunting images. And that did scare me for sure, but I was still curious about A Nightmare on Elm Street. And I went to this guy's house, he was about 12 or 13 or whatever, and showed me all of the terrifying bits from that film. None of the narrative exposition, none of like teenagers just milling around or Nancy talking to her mother or whatever.
So just fast forward.
It was like, well, Tina's death. I think it's the first killing in that film where Tina's body's like flying around the room. It's not just the spectacle of seeing that happen to somebody, but also watching the expression of her boyfriend, Rod, I think is his name.
Rod Lane.
Rod Lane. Yeah. Up yours with a twirling lawnmower. His experience of seeing that happen to his girlfriend and being unable to do anything, just like it freaked me out. And then, of course, you've got the scene later where the centipede comes out of her mouth, and then Johnny Depp being dragged into the bed, and just that image of the blood just shooting up from the mattress was just like, I mean, you know, for a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old or however old I was, watching that stuff, man, it was just game-changing, formative stuff, you know, that lives with you forever. So, you know, I can talk about it now just as enthusiastically as I was talking about it back then, right?
Do you think that was the trigger then, that film's always been with you from that kind of moment?
Well, yeah, because it became my interest. Well, I was interested in two things. I was interested in drawing, which I don't do anymore, and film. And it got to a point where, growing up, going to school, my dad would tape horror films off the TV for me. I might go to car boot sales and pick up things, rent things out from the video store. So, like, I felt by the mid to late 90s, you know, as a sort of a 10, 11-year-old, that I knew a lot about horror films, or at least so I thought. And then I'll never forget, it was 1998. I went to a newsagent, not my local newsagent, but like a newsagent somewhere else, maybe in the centre of Newcastle or something for some reason, with my dad. And I saw the front cover of an issue of the Dark Side magazine. And the cover was the American one-sheet artwork for Piranha 2, The Spawning. And it's got the flying piranhas. And I was just like, firstly, I don't know what that is. It proclaims to be a magazine about horror films. Never read a magazine about horror films before. And I picked it up. And it was that moment that I realised that I knew nothing about horror cinema. Because within that magazine, you had features on Jean Roland, Jess Franco, Dario Argento. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know what the Video Nasties was, that Panic. And it was in that magazine, there was an advert for Alan Bryce's book, the first Video Nasties book. And I think the tagline was something like, "From absurd to zombie flesh eaters, a collector's guide to the most infamous movies ever made." And I was like, well, they're infamous. like, I haven't heard of any of them, you know? I was like, I heard of The Exorcist, heard of A Clockwork Orange, but I hadn't heard of any of these films, and I sent my 20 quid away or whatever it was, which is loads of money, really, when you think about it. Got that book, and that was that. I learned so much, and I've had, I guess, a scholarly or a historian's interest in that stuff since that moment. Then I went to university, did English and film studies, realised that you could, you know, make a career out of doing this nonsense. I was like, what, you can get paid for researching this stuff? People are interested in learning about this stuff. It's not just me, and the rest, they say, is history.
Oh, wow, man, that's awesome. You had love of art and film, but music was a thing for a while too, and still is, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's weird because, you know, I know it's a cliche, but, you know, the horror film audience is oftentimes framed as being like, you know, outcasts, you know, the people on the edge, the fringes of society, like tracking down uncut prints of like zombie creeping flesh or zombie flesh eaters or whatever. And I think that punk for me was very similar to that.
Was that through Return of the Living Dead?
It wasn't, but of course when you see Return of the Living Dead, like retrospectively as a punk, you realise like how amazing and how resonant that film is, for sure. But like, this is the late 90s, so it was all like mainstream stuff like Green Day and all that other stuff. And then told my dad that I like this band called Green Day. He's like, have you heard Stiff Little Fingers? And then the more you listen to that stuff, and as you'll know, you realise that everybody in punk bands or like, you know, hardcore bands, post-hardcore bands, they're all wearing either shirts for other bands.
That's your history lesson in a way.
Yeah.
Like tracing stuff backwards.
Absolutely. Or they're wearing shirts with like a Dawn of the Dead one sheet on it or whatever. And it's amazing how convergent those two, for want of a better word, scenes are. The horror fan and the fan of alternative rock. And I mean, you'll know this as a musician yourself. I mean, the proof is in the pudding here. I mean, you know, you here you are doing a podcast and you're a musician, so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, of course.
So are you guitarist, singer? What route did you go down?
Singer. So like, I mean, in school there was another school band. I mean, everybody's got a story. They're at school and some of their friends start a band, and 9 times out of 10 the band is terrible. And there was a school band that I wasn't involved with, but the guitarist from that band, they were called Two Left Feet. He was a good player, and I always considered myself somewhat of a performer, which is probably why I took the lecturing, to be fair. We formed a band that, I mean, we weren't a big band by any stretch of the imagination, but we did play throughout the UK. We had a record out on an independent label. You know, we were set to go to Europe and do, you know, the punk scene in places like Belgium, for instance. But alas, that didn't happen because I went on to do a PhD, and this is what happened to me. But like, being in a melodic hardcore band, we were called Trip Dash, and we played sort of like riffy, propaganda, Wilhelm scream, double time punk, super political and melodic, but aggressive as well. It was just all of my interests, I guess, sort of coming out, like performing, writing songs in the style of bands that I really admired, wearing horror t-shirts, and then meeting fans of film in the audience and stuff. So it was really like, not to sound too neoliberal, but like character building stuff.
Did you get to play with any heroes of yours?
Yeah, got to play with Stiff Little Fingers. It was one of the last shows we played actually at the, what is it now? I think it's still, the O2 Academy actually. That was probably the biggest show that we did, 2,500 capacity or whatever that venue was. And it's interesting because like, we played that show, so it was us, we were like the local support, but then you had Chelsea, and then you had SLF. Now, Stiff Little Fingers, heroes of mine. So just to share the same space as those legends was enough for me.
Tick box.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, like, and I remember I spoke to the promoter and I was just, how can I make this experience even more special? And I ended up at the O2 Academy. There's like on stage, there is a little stairwell, and there's a little sort of an anonymous space right above the stage that doesn't have a function really. It used to be a bingo hall, right? The 50s through to the 2000s. Maybe it had something to do with that. Long story short, I ended up watching the SLF set sort of from behind the stage, looking onto them. It was amazing for me. Another one, just to give you one more example, we played with the UK Subs as well in York, a venue that isn't there now called Cert 18. A certificate 18. I remember like my lasting memory, because I'm a diabetic, I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I had a massive like sugar crash after that show. And I remember like the then bass player for the UK Subs like having a chat with me, and me just basically not taking anything in at all because I was having this like episode, and they had to call the paramedics. It was just like it was punk as fuck is what it was. Yeah. And I think, to be honest, had I not gone down the academic route and started writing about the horror stuff, I may well have carried on being in the band and to see what's become of that. The bass player for the band, he's in a band now, like a proper band, as it were, doing well.
Superb.
So yeah.
Great stuff, man. So I'm going to throw it back to videos.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned like your relationship with video shops as a kid, seeing the artwork and stuff like that. Did you have a particular one you used to go to? Or was they always changing in your time? I know we had like a bunch of different ones we would go to. Some would stick around, some would close, so it was always changing. But did you have like your go-to one?
I certainly did. Well, there's two, actually. Now, it's interesting because so when I started going to the video shops, Blockbuster was a thing. So this is the early 90s. Blockbuster started in 89, launched its first shop in 89 in Britain, 85 in the States. But we were like in the suburbs in this sort of mining village, former mining village, very small. It wasn't until the late 90s that I had my first experience with like the corporate video model. That was sort of a long way off for me. So we had two small video shops. We had Southside Video, but we also had Marchetti as well, as in the Italian surname Marchetti. That was a former ice cream parlour, opened by an Italian immigrant family in the 1950s. My dad used to work there when it was like this ice cream parlour cafe. And then at some point in the 80s, they, like so many businesses, threw the hat in the ring with video, and the cafe closed, and that space that used to be the cafe became not an especially large space for video, but they probably had sort of 5 shelving units or something.
Yeah, where can we cram a video shop in this shop? There's so many places like that.
For sure, but like it's weird because this must have been such a transitional moment for them because they didn't get in new titles. You just had to rent what was there. One of them was A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, incidentally. And you could buy your favourite video. So that was the thing. They had a sign up that said, purchase your favourite video. And if you give them a $5 or whatever, you could buy whichever video you wanted, which is crazy because if you had an especially good renter, like maybe Nightmare on Elm Street 3 maybe was like one of the most well-known titles. If I'd bought that, they'd never see any money from that ever again. So I really don't understand the business.
How was they operating there? That's an interesting business model.
Well, yeah. Could you even describe it as a business model? I do not know. But yeah, like it was a membership club. You know, you sign up, there was a membership card.
Just wonder where they were getting the tapes from then. If they weren't getting like the brand new releases and it was just like...
Oh, no, they didn't. Sorry, they didn't replenish the stock. Once the stock was gone, it was gone. So whenever they set up their video business, I don't know, like maybe in the late 80s or maybe even before that, I don't even know, they bought stuff and at some point they would have just stopped buying in the new releases.
Right, okay.
And then maybe they weren't making a success of it. Because, I mean, to be honest, the other video shop that I went to, Southside Video, that was the most popular one. And maybe Marchetti just couldn't compete with that. Added to the fact that this was at the height of video racking when, you know, news agents could just phone up a company and say, mate, I need 100 videos, and they would just supply the full thing, the full rotation unit. I mean, Spar was doing that. They had racks of videos, and they were much cheaper to rent than Southside Video, and that's eventually what killed Southside off in the early 2000s. But Southside, which was on the front street in Crokerrook, was just like, you know, a palace. Really small, full to the brim, got the new releases in. That's where I saw Freddy, because they did that thing. They had like a soft porn section, which is just like above.
Just out of reach if you're a bit too young.
Just out of reach. So I'm like, the horror stuff was next to that. And I'm just like, looking up as a kid, what's up there? Why can't I get up there? So, you know, Southside is where all my formative experiences, or the key formative experiences vis-a-vis my relationship to video really, really happened. And when that closed down in maybe 2000, maybe even before that, of course, they sold up and I bought loads of stuff.
Nice.
I mean, because they were selling it off dirt cheap. One year for my birthday, I got like 30 ex-rental VHS cassettes, which to everybody else in the room was like, you've really been stung this birthday. Like, why are your parents buying you this secondhand shit? And I'm like, mate, I've got a full run of the Nightmare on Elm Street films, ex-rental, and I've got Child's Play 3, which still wasn't in circulation officially at that point. So I was laughing my back off, really. The Evil Dead, do you know what I mean? So like, it all came together. At the dawn of the DVD age, my real interest in VHS culture really took off, because of course it disappeared.
Wow.
Do you know what I mean?
So you wasn't, well, like a lot of us, myself included, once DVD came in, VHS was gone. We like threw them all out and replaced them with DVDs. Was you the opposite then? You was buying up all the cheap stuff which we were chucking out.
It's funny, I bought up a lot of VHS when DVD came in because, I mean, HMV, I mean, you'll probably remember this yourself, they were selling everything off for like £2. I remember buying up stuff that I hadn't seen, like Cronenberg's Rabid, Videodrome, all the stuff that is an 11-year-old I just had not seen.
Yeah, all that stuff you were seeing in the magazines where I'd not heard of this. It's like I can finally get my hands on it.
Precisely. And like even the Universal horror films, actually. Dracula, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which was always a title, it was a deleted title, randomly turned up in this sell-through, sell-off in HMV in the early 2000s. So like, yeah, it was just, had it not been for DVD, maybe I wouldn't have seen all these films because they became so accessible because they were being sold off on cheap VHS, the format that nobody wanted anymore.
A lot of us are familiar with like how much rental tapes cost back in the day. As you would see, like the stickers, you probably were buying all these, getting them for like £2 and it'd still have the sticker on there saying $79.95, which even now sounds insane. But I think what's interesting in your book is you do the conversion. And I think you put like in 1982 a tape would cost £60, but the modern day equivalent of that is around £190. It's like, I can't even fathom it being that amount.
Well, it's crazy. Even like if you think about buying hardware to play that stuff on, like if you were one of the few who was prepared to splash out £800 then, which is like thousands of pounds, like so much money, you know, which of course is why most people rented the machines as well as the cassettes themselves because they were just prohibitively expensive for most people.
So do you still collect tapes today?
Well, if I see something, I'll buy it. But like I've had in my possession some sought after tapes over the years that I've sold and sort of regret it now, to be honest. Even though like when I lived in Leicester, I mean, I love telling this story because it's just one of those stories that like every collector, if you collect anything and you hear stories about people coming across hauls, you know, so, this is the haul that I got from the car boot sale today or whatever. I landed upon a haul of cassettes. I mean, pre-cert video collectors, it's the kind of thing that made me fall over, so it would make everybody else fall over. It was Leicester Market. It's an outside market. And famously, Gary Lineker's parents have a fruit and vegetable stall there, right? And there was a seller there, and sadly she died. She's called Jane. And Jane had been a market seller for years. And when I was at De Montfort, of course, some of the staff who worked at De Montfort Uni had been going to Leicester Market for years. They were film fans. They'd bought stuff off this Jane in the past. And I just said to one of my colleagues at De Montfort, I was like, did she ever sell VHS on a market stall? Like video nasties, like etc. blah, 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 blah. He's like, yeah, of course she did. And I was like, right. So, I went to see Jane and I said to her like, Jane, you don't know me, blah, 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 but I'm interested in horror videos on VHS. And she's like, what? Like The Driller Killer, Zombie Flesh Eaters, and started to sort of list like obviously the well-known nasty titles. And I'm like, yeah, exactly that. And she's like, all right then, well, why don't you come round to my house and I'll show you what I've got. And mate, Jesus Christ, this is weird. So I went in and she had a very normal house with a very normal living room. But next to the TV, she just so happened to have 2 shelves of immaculate pre-cert video cassettes. And I'm not talking like the common stuff that you see all the time. I'm talking like Cannibal Holocaust, I Spit in Your Grave, Don't Open the Window, and The Beast in Heat. Right? Now, The Beast in Heat obviously is like a £2,000 tape or whatever. And I clocked that straight away. But of course, by the time that I'd spent some money there, she was cottoning on, obviously, to the fact that some of these tapes are really valuable. So she was subsequently cross-referencing prices, blah, 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 blah. So the initial bargain that I thought I was going to get was not as cheap as I thought it was. But nevertheless, it was very, very cheap. And I managed to acquire The Beast in Heat for a paltry amount. I mean, it was the stuff that video collector pre-cert dreams are made of, really. I sound like I'm bragging about this. I'm not. It was just one of those things where, like, if you collect this stuff, you dream of those experiences. And just to see all those tapes in one place.
Well, that's one of the fun things I think about video collecting, because essentially it should be worthless. It's a dead format, which it's not worth anything. It looks like crap. It's not like vinyl that you can justify that it still sounds good. No, it looks shit.
Yes.
But that is the fun thing about it. You will still stumble upon amazing, like say, hauls or finds, because to most people, they're not worth anything, but to us, to see it, it's amazing. So I think it's just a matter of sticking it out and those good luck chances will come along.
For sure. And I think that luck plays a huge role in certainly the story that I just told, because even though, VHS is quote-unquote worthless and so many people discarded it, Jane still had those. They were the only videos in her house.
Why had she saved them?
Well, because in the 90s, when there's a market for bootleg cassettes, of course, lots of market sellers were dubbing I Spit in Your Grave, Cannibal Holocaust, and all these things and selling them at the market.
Gotcha.
You know, so there was economic value, or a perceived economic value, to holding on to these. But of course, when DVD took off and you could acquire uncut I Spit in Your Grave from America or whatever, her orders for I Spit in Your Grave probably decreased.
Yeah, and it just still sat on the shelf.
Yeah.
Wow. I love that.
Mental.
So when you was doing research for your book, Rewind Replay, I think you said like you was going to eBay to try and find VHS memorabilia as research and stuff like that. Was you getting like distracted? Oh, that tape's there when it was coming up in searches. Oh, I've put a sneaky bid on that one. Or did you find anything there? Or what kind of memorabilia did you find whilst you were looking?
I was very fortunate. I mean, I was writing that book probably for a 10-year period off and on.
Yeah, was it like 2014 you started it?
Yeah. That's when it started. Bearing in mind that like for a few years I'd been sort of acquiring copies of, for instance, Video Business and these are the trade magazines because they were very rare. And when I saw them, I tended to buy them just because, you know, I'm interested in British cinema, popular culture. But the stuff that I was trying to acquire was the stuff that rarely came up for sale, to be honest.
Right.
Everyone and their grandmother these days is selling like, you know, a Driller Killer or whatever. You know, the big hitting video nasty titles. Much more difficult to come across is things like the first children's videos that were released,
right.
For example. Companies like Intervision, of course, would put out kids' films. VCL would put out kids' films. All these pre-cert labels that everybody knows, but most people, you know, there are some exceptions, but most people are interested in the horror and in the sex films, basically. They're the big hitters. Whereas I was looking for things like catalogues for distributors, which some people have, but few people want to part with. Things like flyers, leaflets, documentation, anything that could speak to the inner workings of the company rather than just their reputation as handlers of video nasties or whatever. And you'll know this, like the stuff that Mark Morris has done, like Nigel Wingrove, Art of the Nasty, Alan Bryce's Video Nasties books. It's all about horror and sex. That's all it is. And whereas I'm super interested in that, those two things were hugely significant to the video industry, there's much more to it than that. And finding stuff pertaining to that material was very, very difficult. And to be honest, on eBay, there was this one time a briefcase came up for sale. It was something like video industry briefcase. It was really oddly worded, but I put a bid in, got it for about 40 quid or whatever. And in that briefcase changed everything because there was letters from video wholesalers to potential video retailers. There were flyers, things to do with the Video Recordings Act. There were reports from the BBFC about specific cuts that were being made to specific films. Wow. There was also in that briefcase, and this is perhaps a bit too vanilla, but like there was a flyer for a company called Hollywood Nights that it materialized was the first video symbol group. If you've got a news agent and you want to join forces with Spar or Nisa or Premiere, you can. Well, Hollywood Nights was the first one of those for the video market. So if you were a video retailer, you know, Blockbuster was opening next door and you felt like you needed some corporate power, you could sign up to Hollywood Nights and they would kit you out with a facade and like branded carrier bags and stuff.
Oh, is that the one you mentioned in your book where it says you keep your name?
Yep, that's it, Hollywood Nights.
Right.
And I remember Hollywood Nights. Nobody does. We had a Hollywood Nights 5 miles away from my house.
I think we had a Hollywood Video, but not a Hollywood Nights.
Not a Hollywood Nights. Well, Hollywood Nights, they were there and then they weren't there. They disappeared as I discuss in my book. But the fact that I managed to stumble across this flyer in this briefcase, I mean, I had no idea who would put this briefcase together, but it was full of material that you can't get in any archive. And frankly, very few collectors have over the years held on to because the emphasis has been on like, you know, can I get the uncut, whatever.
Nuts, man.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But I do find like, you know, media history is a lot like that. Well, history generally, stumbling on things that you haven't necessarily gone looking for is all part of that process. You know, the narratives of history are only as they are because historians have come across specific sources that enable them to tell that story. And that's essentially what Rewind Replay is. It's a history of that period driven by the materials that were available to me.
Yes. At the beginning of the book, you speak about the last Blockbuster documentary. I had its director, Taylor Morden, on this podcast last year. Have the two of you been in touch?
No, I've never spoken. In fact, because you've got the last Blockbuster and then you've got those other like documentaries like Adjust Your Tracking and stuff, right? Yeah. And I haven't spoken with anybody from that side of things, to be honest. I mean, the last Blockbuster for me is the best of those documentaries. Now, I know it's obviously doing something very different to Adjust Your Tracking, but the emphasis is on the nostalgia and trying to sort of preserve history for ultimately the purpose of nostalgia, because it makes us feel good because all that stuff happened in the past and it's important that we preserve it. When I was writing Rewind Replay as an academic, I was trying my best to make the book as objective as possible and not make it a nostalgia fest, because I didn't want to skew the narrative and be like, oh, isn't this stuff really, really cool? And that be the end of the book. I mean, I think all that stuff is really, really cool. And as a fan of this stuff, yeah, I'm super enthusiastic and I'm a super, I'm a nerd and all the rest of it. But for the book, I wanted it to be, right, this is the history of of the video shop. And, you know, I like to think that I've tried to capture some of the dynamism of that period without geeking out too much, if you see what I'm saying. Because I do think there is a tendency, just because so much of us, yourself, others, have so many fond memories of this period, that the discourse is oftentimes anchored to saying, oh, wow, gee whiz, isn't this amazing? Isn't this cool? Aren't these the halcyon days? Wasn't Thatcher evil for, like, you know, trampling independent video business? Isn't Blockbuster evil for And I think Thatcher's evil, and I think Blockbuster ultimately is evil. But I wanted to try and, like, dial it back and paint the picture as it was, as it happened, without having a political agenda to say one thing's good or one thing's bad. I just wanted to be like, well, this is how it happened.
I think the last Blockbuster gave an interesting insight into Blockbuster, though, because I think the overview of it is that it wiped out all the independent stores. But when it focuses on the one in Bend, Oregon, there's almost like two sides to Blockbuster. There is the big marketing thing that kind of crushed everybody, but I think there was another side of it that allowed independent chains to continue, which is what the one in Bend, Oregon is, and that's why it's managed to weather the storm, I guess, in a way.
I think what's really interesting about that documentary, and what I think it successfully captures, is the notion that individuals are running these stores.
Yes.
We can talk about Blockbuster as like a faceless corporation and evil and all the rest of it, which it is. I mean, ultimately it's there to make money, and if it's not making money, you're done for. But I think if we oversimplify the narrative and just say that about Blockbuster, and just say that, oh, wasn't Blockbuster terrible, we aren't doing justice to the nuances of that history and, frankly, the personalities of the individuals who worked in Blockbuster to make it what it was.
Yeah.
Right? You know, my experience of one Blockbuster in Westerhope in Newcastle, that was my Blockbuster. It was like a 5-mile drive. The experience that I had at that store was not the same as my experience of Blockbuster Express and South Shields. And that's because different people are running it. And it might be a faceless corporation ultimately, but within those stores, you had people who were oftentimes film fans adding to the experience.
But I think here in the UK, we perhaps underestimate the power and monopoly that Ritz had prior to Blockbuster. You said they were like one of the initial big chains to really come along and monopolize the market. I think you mentioned that Ritz were pretty brutal in their approach, whereas when Blockbuster did come in, they were a little bit more friendly.
It's interesting. And I mean, thank you for, like, you've clearly read the book, and I appreciate it, because I wanted to do Ritz justice insofar as that oftentimes Ritz is like written off as just one of Blockbuster's acquisitions.
Yeah.
Blockbuster came in, bought Ritz, the end. When actually Blockbuster owes so much to Ritz.
Laid a foundation for them in a way.
Well, they certainly did. I mean, they were...
Fly over the UK, you'll see all the yellow and red. That's where you need to go.
That's right, but it's funny, you know, you mention Ritz to people now, and a lot of people just have forgotten Ritz, but like, they had 800 shops eventually, which was loads. They were opening 6 a week at one point.
6 a week.
6 a week. So like, it's interesting because the video trade, the independent dealers, hated Ritz because they were like, basically, you need to sell us your shop or we'll just demolish you anyway. And they pulled no punches, and it was really brutal and, you know, capitalism at its worst.
Right.
Managing directors of Ritz writing letters to the video business, trade papers, being as brutal as that, saying that, you know, we don't owe anyone a living, we are going to bulldoze into your town and we are going to buy your businesses, you know, by hook or crook or whatever. Whereas Blockbuster, if you speak to American scholars, they'll say, well, yeah, well, that's what Blockbuster did in the States. But they were just way more cautious in the British context, Blockbuster. Because when they opened their first store in 1989, they were just sort of like in the background, looking from the sidelines at what Ritz were doing, and saying that, okay, so Ritz are opening all these stores, which are quite small, like they're not huge. We, Blockbuster, want to really corporatize the video experience. We're going to open big stores, really spacious, really airy. Sort of do what Ritz are doing insofar as that, trying to make it respectable for the consumer. But we're also going to like have an edge over Ritz, an American edge. And ultimately that's what they did. So whereas journalists writing in video magazines didn't like Ritz's attitude, because they thought they were doing the business as much harm as good, so to speak. Blockbuster were friendly. They didn't have as many stores. They were like, yeah, you know, we're not going to do anything to harm you. No, we're taking our time. We're getting a sense of the climate, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, the early 90s recession happens. Ritz is in the shit. And Blockbuster, with all their, you know, capital, are like, all right, well, we'll buy all your stores. And that's when you start seeing Blockbuster Expresses because they are the Ritz stores.
Gotcha.
So all the Blockbuster Expresses that we see were old Ritz stores. And if you compare them to the bigger Blockbusters, you can see there's a difference. Blockbuster Express really captured what Ritz didn't do as well as Blockbuster. You know, pokey old stores that were sort of one step removed from like the corporate gloss that Blockbuster aced when it came to the bigger stores. I'm not saying necessarily that we should be like thanking Blockbuster for anything per se, but I think it's an understatement to claim that Blockbuster were just evil and therefore we shouldn't engage with the nuances of their history, because I mean, that doesn't help anyone.
Through the research for your book, was it surprising to see how popular the format continues to be to this day and still growing?
Well, the thing is, I've been around video collecting for years, and I can't imagine a scenario whereby it ever goes away. And in fact, you know, we see, I could be getting my figures wrong here, but I'm sure like a sealed copy of Back to the Future on VHS sold in the States for like 20 grand or something.
That's a weird...
Yeah, it is weird. Like, it is weird, but auction houses are now cottoning on to the fact that these are antiques. I mean, not quite antiques, but they're, you know, they're retro and they have historical value now. And if some idiot is prepared to spend 20 grand on a copy of Back to the Future, who are we to stop them? So I suppose, do I endorse that? No, not really. But I can see it doesn't come as any surprise to me that that kind of thing is happening now.
I think that whole thing was very skewed though. I think it kind of led to loads of people in the public like thinking, oh, I think I've got a copy of Back to the Future in my loft.
Yeah.
Which is one which they bought from Woolworths for $9.99. Whereas when you read into the article, the one that sold that much was like, I think it was like a promo cassette. It was still sealed and it was owned by the guy who played Biff Tannen in Back to the Future.
Yeah. So it had that sort of like, yeah. And we see that in the pre-cert collecting community as well. See it, for example, a copy of The Beast in Heat comes up for sale and it happens to have been owned by maybe Mark Morris,
right,
or somebody that maybe like Nigel Wingrove, or somebody who has had some role in helping to facilitate the mythology around the video nasties through all these coffee table volumes. That, for a period at least, was deemed prestigious and worthy of maybe a couple of £100 or whatever.
Yeah.
More than you would pay if it was like from, you know, if I was selling it or whatever.
Got it from Jane on Leicester Market.
Got it from Jane from Leicester Market. Yeah. After this podcast goes out, like anybody who's bought a VHS cassette from Jane is going to go on eBay and say, this has got the Jane factor. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest.
You cover 20th Century Flicks in Bristol and Video Odyssey in Liverpool in your book. Have you had a chance to visit either one of them?
Not yet. And I really want to come through straight to video as well. Because, mate, it's like, I wish you'd opened 2 years ago. You know, your store would have been a great case study as well for that conclusion. And I do wonder, are you going to be like the last one? Are more people going to do this now?
Well, there's Dead Format that's opened in Blackpool as well. I don't know if you've heard of them.
No, I haven't actually.
And I stole nearly all my ideas from Slashback Video out in California.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And also, like, have you ever had the chance to visit Scarecrow Video in Seattle?
No.
Man, I mean, that's amazing as well. I mean, they've been around since God knows when. And they're certainly the biggest in the world, I think, still. What really struck me about 20th Century Flicks, and I haven't visited it, but I've seen the documentary about it, and just the idea that, yes, it's about nostalgia, and I would say that it's chiefly nostalgic. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Like, you're running one of these things. Have you set up that store for nostalgic purposes, or what? Like, I mean, what is your aim?
No one's really asked me that.
Well, no, because I think it's an interesting question, and I don't want like a full business plan or anything. But I just think clearly you are wedded to this, the history of video in popular culture.
Yeah.
Are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it for the community? Are you doing it for film fans? Who are you doing it for? I should be interviewing you.
I know, yeah. Well, it's me and my friend Chris who've done it. I mean, I've had like the Straight to Video name for quite some time now, through music, through the podcast. And then my friend Chris runs this shop and he just had this space above it. And he said, I just want to do something cool in there. So I want to do some kind of 80s thing and incorporate all that. And because I'm such a fan of the whole video industry, I said, let's focus it a little bit and make it a video shop. So my way of looking is, I guess there is a business, I don't know, view from it, because I'm thinking that if we open like an 80s shop or just selling movie memorabilia, if someone heard about the shop and said, oh, there's like a new film shop where you can buy film stuff from, people go, oh, I might check it out. But once you say, have you been in the new video shop? It's almost like a pitch to these people and they get intrigued by it. But I think initially we're doing it for ourselves and from our heart initially. We're following our heart before our brains.
I think, you know, what you've just said, following your heart before your head or whatever, that's a fan. That's a film fan anyway. people aren't necessarily amassing loads of shit in their house because they're thinking about it, right? You do it because you're passionate about it. And I just think that, what you're doing is like, I think it speaks to the moment that we're in, whereby there is sort of like a niche, and I'm going to use the term hipster, not directed at you, but sort of like a new sort of chic, retroactive interest in video culture that is not just anchored to the fan community, but is actually sort of rippling through popular culture, generally speaking.
Thank you, Stranger Things.
Yeah, well, yeah, Stranger Things, It, the Fear Street films. Isn't it interesting that a lot of this stuff essentially is anchored to horror in popular culture? Horror was, for so many companies, the prime renting video genre in the States, in the UK. And I think for so many of us, our memories of the video shop isn't necessarily renting dramas or romantic comedies or something with Patrick Swayze in it. It's horror, because those are the communal experiences that we had when we were young, to frighten ourselves, character building, formative experiences that so many of us have. And they coalesce around horror and those sort of forbidden genres that, we probably shouldn't have been watching. Or at least that's what society was telling our parents, right?
Which just adds to it as well. You're not supposed to watch this, so I got to watch it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For sure.
The more you tell me I can't watch it, the more I want to watch it.
Well, I mean, that's it. And that was certainly my experience. You really shouldn't be watching that stuff, or that's a 15 or whatever. And I'm like, well, what? Why are 15-year-olds or 18-year-olds allowed to engage with this? And me, as a 12-year-old, for some reason, arbitrarily, I'm deemed too immature to appreciate Jaws the Revenge. So I just think, congrats to you for doing that. And I wish you all the success with it. I think it's important that, from the historian's perspective, that new generations are introduced to this stuff, because the history of video, to be more boring again, is so important to like how we engage with media today. It wouldn't have been that way had it not been for physical media in the video revolution.
Definitely. You're headed to Derby on Saturday the 24th of September to do a talk all about this at Quad.
I am.
As part of their Paris Cinema Festival. You're looking forward to be heading down south again. A little bit further north than Leicester, but definitely in the area.
I love it when, if you say you're heading down south to somebody in the Midlands, I can't believe you said that, actually. Come down to Derby. Yeah, it's great to be down south in Derby, yeah. Well, yeah, mate, I was at Paris Cinema last year because I was promoting a British horror book that I edited. It was great. I know some of the team down there.
Yeah, they're awesome, man.
Yeah, they really are sound. And just to be asked to go down and talk about Rewind Replay, it's good. I was originally going to do a talk, but it's purely a Q&A now. And my friend Neil Jackson from Lincoln's going to interview me. I'm going to sell some books, hopefully, and just hopefully give an overview of the book and try and convince some people that it's worthy of their 15 quid or whatever,
What else is in the pipeline for you in the future then?
So at the moment, I've had study leave for a year. I'm doing a project that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on British horror cinema of the 80s and 90s. Essentially, I've just got a contract with the British Film Institute to write a book about that 20-year period and essentially account for, at least in academic circles, a blind spot really. Still today, when we talk about British horror, either people talk about Hammer and say that it essentially died in the late 70s or whatever.
I think you've mentioned that before. That's interesting that Hammer kind of finished in the late 70s. What do you think would happen if they just held out a few more years?
Well, the thing is, people lament the demise of Hammer in 79, but I mean, they moved to TV in the 80s and they made Hammer House of Horror, Hammer House of Mystery and Suspense on TV, essentially short films. And, a lot of them are very good, actually. And I think that, part of the emphasis should be not so much on, isn't it a tragedy that Hammer weren't making films for theatrical release anymore, but actually looking at that moment as a time of technological shift where you've got video and TV, and British horror might not necessarily be seen in the cinema as much, but it was being consumed avariciously on video. Even in the UK, those Hammer TV plays were, released as double features on video, and they were released on video in the US as well. And I want to say, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that those Hammer TV shows were released on video as double features in the States with intros from Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. That's like a horror culture of a different sort, right? For a new generation. So the new book, eventually, as it will become, is going to be a history of British horror films in those 2 decades, looking at like domestic production and the extent to which these films were distributed all over the world, because a lot of the time so many bad films were produced during that period that it's not deemed worthy of analysis. People would rather talk about, Chariots of Fire or My Beautiful Laundrette or the films of Ken Loach or Mike Leigh or something, which of course are important, but, there is a rich tradition of horror production in Britain from 1980 to 1999.
What's the one you've mentioned in one of your talks? Is it like Don't Open Till Christmas or something like that?
Don't Open Till Christmas, indeed. A classic from 1984. Now, I'm going to have to say something about that film now that you've mentioned it. That film is interesting because, okay, ultimately it's not very good, right? But as like a text, as a object, it is fascinating because it's a slasher film.
Okay.
Set at Christmas, and the slasher, the killer, is killing people who dress up as Santa Claus, which of course is utterly ludicrous and mental, but it was made by an American producer, co-produced by one of the financiers of Last House on the Left and Friday the 13th. Co-produced by this individual who also was the person who came up with the "just keep repeating it's only a movie" tagline. The person who launched the whole "don't go in the basement, don't do this, don't do that" trend. So when you learn stuff like this, it's like, okay, so this is like a British film that didn't do anything, but it's a legitimate attempt by American exploitation producers to make an exploitation horror film modelled on the American slasher film in London. But when you watch it, it feels like a British sexploitation film from the 70s. So it's like this weird melting pot of weirdness and very, very interesting from an industrial perspective.
What's the poster like? I need to go and look for the poster.
Well, it was never released theatrically in Britain. It went straight to video. Vestron put it out in the UK on video. And it's an amazing, again, of its moment, colourful image of a kitchen knife being stabbed into a Christmas present. The tagline is, "It was the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring. They were all dead." Which is like...
a lot of thought went into that one.
A lot of thought. It was like, who signed that off, you know? But yeah, super interesting. And okay, so it's not a classic of British cinema, but it's very telling of that transitional period when the British film industry was falling apart. People weren't going to the cinemas, but video was taking off.
Superb. Got to check it out. You add North Shore to the list. I'll add that to my list.
Yeah, well, you probably... I might be thanking you more for North Shore than you'll be thanking me for doing it up until Christmas, but we'll see.
Sweet. Johnny, thank you ever so much for chatting with me, mate. I've loved it. That hour's just flown by.
No, cheers,
Talk
mate.
about this stuff all day.
Well, thanks again for having me, mate. And all the best of luck with the shop and the podcast and all your other creative pursuits.
You too, mate. Well, keep in touch. Have a great time in Derby. Hopefully catch up with you at some point that weekend.
For sure, mate. All right, all the best. And thanks again, pal.
Massive thanks to Johnny Walker for taking the time to chat with me all about the history and his own experiences of VHS videos over the years. And please, if you enjoyed that chat, then check out his book Rewind Replay, which is available now from EdinburghUniversityPress.com. And if you're in the Derby area at the end of the month, head on over and say hi to Johnny at Derby Quad's Paracinema Festival on Saturday the 24th of September. Also, keeping on the video theme, the 80s Video Shop is now open and creating a buzz in Alfreton, Derbyshire. The shop is currently open on Saturdays and Sundays throughout September, and we've just announced a Halloween horror day for Sunday the 16th of October, where iconic horror artist and previous guest on this show, Graham Humphreys, will be paying us a visit. The event will run from 12 noon till 4 in the afternoon, so for all the up-to-date info, check out at 80s Video Shop on social media. That's all for today's show. This was a fun one, and I hope you enjoyed it too, so until we chat again, take care and speak soon.